Get ready to bridge worlds and elevate your understanding of growth, resilience, and the power of connections. I am Dr. Malcolm, and I'm with my lovely wife,
Amanda. Today, we're turning to the creative side of our world through storytelling, words, and growth.
So let's jump in. Starting with Amanda's journey from her love of stories to becoming the creative force she is today. So let's talk about your storytelling. How did books shape you and your passion for literature?
Just like most writers, I think reading and books were sort of the gateway drug to the creative process. I remember, may have even been pre-verbal, like my dad carrying me down to the Midvale Library in East Falls in Philly. And they always had a story time where Mr. Moody, who was the least moody person in the world, was the head librarian. And he would turn all the lights out and the parents would be there with their kids. And he'd just read us a nighttime story. And we were, like in our pajamas with the booties. So there is that. There is the Vacation Reading Club, which I always won because I read the most amount of books. I'm not a competitive person, but I am competitive with myself. There was third grade when I was given the BFG, the Roald Dahl book to read. And it was like one of my first kind of grown-up books because there was more print than illustration on the pages. There was when I got into my early 20s and I was sort of processing some earlier childhood trauma. And I was working at the front desk of my friend's father's law firm. And all I did was eat, sleep, answer phones, and read. And I read like 34 books, and I was terrifically depressed. And the books literally kept me alive because if I wasn't working, sleeping, or eating, I was reading. So it literally became a lifeline to me. So that's sort of a little history of my books. The last thing I'm going to end on is it being a sort of like sneaky underground thing also as like an early teenager sneaking in and getting Clan the Cave Bear because there was some racy sex scenes with the cave people and and we didn't take it out of the library, but the page was folded over so the kids knew where to look for it. And then like Anne Rice, Malcolm and I have been talking about nonstop today. It seems like Interview the Vampire Lestat, and that series. That was also sort of like an entryway into this sort of supernatural, which I'm obsessed with as well.
So Amanda, based on your experience as a literature professor, why did you transition to entrepreneurship with Amanda Writes, Edits, and Consults?
So I had several reasons, and none of them are creative reasons. I wasn't making enough money. I had too many students in my classes to give them my undivided attention. I had a 3-year contract as an adjunct. I wasn't paid for, the 8 hours of grading I did a week. And maybe I should have used more rubrics, but I was sort of exhausted after COVID and teaching to 28 blank Zoom screens. So I couldn't read their body language. I couldn't read their facial expressions. It sort of took the life out of me and my joy of teaching. So I sort of see it as it had become this sort of like abusive relationship. It was self-abuse. I was condoning the way that my life was. It was sort of stifling my own creativity because I was just drained. So I did have money saved up. So I did have much more privilege than most people. I could step away from adjuncting. I couldn't see myself in academia teaching 4 comp classes every semester for 3 or 4 years. And so it was one of the hardest things I had to do. It was like breaking up with a partner that I had outgrown. I've taught thousands of students. These students completely and utterly changed my life, rearranged my DNA. I'm still in touch with a number of them. And so I stepped away and now I have individual clients. So it's almost like my office hours used to be, where I can just focus on their work, whether it's a crime procedural or a kid's book or a poetry manuscript or a creative nonfiction memoir. I can Zoom with my clients and I can mark up all of their pages and get it back to them. And they're just as appreciative as my students were. But for me, it was a better way to organize my life so I could finish my book. I was just being more realistic about money as well.
Wow. So you also have been writing in finishing your first novel, which is incredible. So you've been balancing both your novel as well as your business, and which is fascinating to see you day to day in doing this. What was your inspiration behind the book that you wrote and the challenges of balancing the creativity of that book while you're running the business?
Excellent question, husband. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh my God. So my book is tentatively called The Undercovers. And elevator pitch is it's about two undercover FBI agents that infiltrate a radical animal rights group, which is suspected of domestic terrorism. And I have a lot of overlapping spheres of my life, and John Jay College of Criminal Justice overlapped with the undercover FBI aspect. I have always watched those shows since I was a teenager watching Law and Order. I think that it's helped me process my own trauma watching a lot of these true crime shows as a woman. You know, you look at Law and Order SVU, and most of them start out with a scantily clad, murdered, and sexually assaulted woman. And so I could either avoid that my entire life or use that to reprocess my own trauma from a safe distance. The detectives mostly found the guy that did it and the motive why. So that's how my writing overlaps with criminal justice, and specifically the psychological profile of an undercover officer who back in the 80s and 90s would go undercover deep cover. So for months and years, which, as you might imagine, would cause some difficulties if one had a family and kids and then was living for months or years in a domestic terrorism cell and has feelings for people in the cell, falls in love, starts a new family. So I was sort of obsessed with what it takes to be an undercover operative and how you keep your lives separate and how they inevitably just bleed into one another. And I think that everyone can relate to the feeling of getting our story straight, whether it's code switching or who we tell what to. There's the therapist, there's the partner, there's the friends, there's the work facade. And so that's sort of where the idea came from. I read 50 books about undercovers, about domestic terrorism, about animal rights activism. I've interviewed dozens of people. Some were retired FBI. They talked to me off the record in confidence. And some of the animal rights people I know who have served time for liberating mink, for instance. So I just went down that rabbit hole.
I really enjoyed that, Amanda. It's fascinating to see the steps that you take to create this sort of book. I haven't read it, just so everyone knows. I have read nothing of this book, just heard some of the pieces that she shared with you, and it made me feel other things. So I'm really excited to take part in reading this book. A lot of what I learned about Amanda and the things that she's done really remind me of what we call learning agility. Learning agility is not being agile in terms of the way businesses think of agile these days and how that became a big trend. But learning agility is the ability to take your past experiences, no matter how good or bad they were, and then flip them into a brand new situation and then take advantage of those experiences in the past to make your new experiences better for yourself and sometimes better for other people. And with thinking about Amanda and what you've been talking about today in terms of that trauma that you're talking about, the experiences that you had from being a teacher and professor at John Jay College, and then looking how that's been able to be a huge factor for good or bad in terms of the past, or just the trauma, as I mentioned before, towards a better future, towards a better situation in terms of how you're writing, how you're dealing with your business, how you could be better. So I really appreciate the things that you've done. It's really been something for me as a person who's done a lot of research on learning agility, a person who does a lot of focus on it with other businesses and organizations that I've consulted with. It really allows me to reflect from a personal standpoint. It doesn't always have to be about business with learning agility. It's about how you can grow as individuals, how you can take your good experiences and your bad, the trauma that you've dealt with. Everyone has had something that they dealt with in the past that's had a big effect on them. But the key is, how can I flip that and really reshape the lives that we live? So thank you for sharing that. It's something that's been helpful for me to understand from a personal standpoint when I think of it so much from a business standpoint.
Thank you, Malcolm. I do want to say one thing that I thought of when you were speaking, and that is just to make the distinction between like writing in your journal, which is fabulous, about capital T, lowercase t, trauma. I'm in recovery communities online, and sometimes someone will say, my name is Amanda. I'm recovering from everything. I'm recovering from all of the things that men often say. But I do want to make a distinction between writing in your journal or talking to your therapist or speaking to a friend in confidence with writing, with good writing, with creative nonfiction that flows, that has deep characters, dramatic conflict, dialogue that adds to character or moves the plot forward. In other words, everything that I look for in a piece of creative writing, whether it's like a poem, a narrative poem, or short stories or novels. So the process of recovering from trauma is the editing of the piece of writing. You can get immediate satisfaction from pouring your heart out on the page, but it is the objective side, the quote unquote rational side of the brain, reconstructing your trauma, your story, into something that's a beautiful work of art that demands identification, where you name the unnamed. That's where the magic happens.
That's great. That's great. Amanda's story so far is a great example of how creativity and adaptability can go hand in hand. But what makes storytelling such a powerful tool for connection? Let's talk a little bit about that next. So, Amanda, tell us about the emotional power of storytelling in creating empathy and understanding.
Awesome. So I could talk about this all day. I'm going to give you a happy story, and then I'm going to give you a challenging story to demonstrate this. Regarding the more emotional power of storytelling or writing in general, I had two students that I randomly matched to work in pairs during a Comp 1 class. One was Jewish and one was Muslim. It doesn't really have anything to do with the story, but they came from different circles. And they chose to keep working with one another all semester long. And they were sort of like doing peer review on their research projects. And I could kind of tell there was a little electricity between them. So I would normally mix up groups, but I just kind of let them do their thing. And then years later, they came to me separately just to pop into my office hours to say hello. And they had both taken me for Comp 1, Comp 2, and then one took me for a lit class and the other took me for a creative writing workshop. And so evidently they had gotten married and had kids very quickly. And so we caught up and I looked at baby pictures and everything. And then I said, what was going on? Like, whatever you feel comfortable telling me that led to this. I saw the before and after, but I didn't see the during. And he said, I was improving my writing skills throughout your class, Professor Harris. And so I kept writing her love letters after class. That was sort of how they fell in love, because it took a while to sort of get together socially, physically outside of class. And he basically wooed her like it was an epistolary novel or something. So that's one way that people can connect and be empathetic. There have been scientific tests done, brain scans done about how you can literally be a more empathetic person after you read novels. And this is novels. This is fiction. This is not creative nonfiction. This is not history books. So empathy could make you fall in love. Also, another side of empathy is working on my book. It's primarily set in or having to do with factory farms, so processing animals into meat products. To write a believable novel, I had to watch hundreds of hours of undercover and not undercover videotapes of animals being processed, so killed. and killed alive and sliced up alive and freezing to post outside alive and things that are so horrible you can't even imagine that. It's just like a bloody apocalypse. So I would do this research and then I would be like, okay, I have to do something good for myself. So I'd unroll my yoga mat, but all I could do is lie there. So I would just, I guess corpse pose is still yoga. I would do that because I felt that that was the next step in how I create a believable, the world building. I had to experience it, experience what my characters were experiencing. So that's sort of the gamut and everything in between regarding the emotional power of storytelling, where it literally, like, you can feel it in your body when you tell a story.
Wow.
And people understand you in a way that they never did before. So it's really the way I see it. It's necessity and it's a survival instinct. And if you're good at storytelling, you will be more successful in your career. You will make more money. You will be a kinder person. You will be able to have discussions that don't escalate. All of those things are emotional intelligence and learning it.
So let's go further. Tell us about a project or a story that you worked on that illustrates resilience, diversity, and growth, since we're heading in that direction.
So a project of a story that I worked on that illustrates resilience, diversity, or growth is, once again, my novel, but the part of the novel that concerned the male undercover FBI agent. My old hairdresser's dad used to be undercover FBI, long retired from the FBI, became a flight attendant, met his third wife there. They moved to Key West, lived happily ever after. So I was connected to him, and that's who I based my character Bobby on. And so I connected with him and asked him to have an informal interview. The interview was overlooking the beach, and I was sort of plying him with gin and tonics, and his third wife insisted that she be present while I was interviewing him, which was great, of course. But we basically just listened to him tell stories, incredible, unbelievable stories that involved jumping out of helicopters, that involved being undercover for so many months that he grew a beard and had like fake tattoos and picked my friend up from school, and my friend was crying and thought he was being kidnapped because he didn't even recognize his own father. So long, deep undercover. My friend's mother had bipolar disorder, so it was a mess. And he was telling us, stories of the Colombian necktie and corruption, and it was fascinating. And so towards the end of the interview, I always ask whomever I'm interviewing, is there anything that I forgot or that I left out? And then, of course, the stories keep coming even more. So the sun is setting, and we're getting our stuff together. And I turned to his partner and I said, I'm sorry, it's probably boring for you. You've probably heard all of these stories many times before. And she started crying and she said, Amanda, I've never heard any of these stories. This is a really good example of storytelling and resilience and growth. And the man that I interviewed said that he was so happy that he did this, that back when he was an FBI agent, there were so many suicides, there was so much drinking and drug use among his friends, that it wasn't culturally acceptable for a man, especially in a sort of quote-unquote macho role, to talk about their feelings. And that he felt a huge sense of relief, sharing. And then he turned to his wife and he said, I feel closer to you now. And then she couldn't even talk. So that's an extreme case. That doesn't happen every day, of course, but it's my most powerful tale about the power of storytelling.
I love that story. I know you shared that before, and obviously you and I spent time down in Key West and love it down there. But to hear about the impact that this guy had on his wife is just amazing, and how that really just helped develop your book and where you're going. And it really tells how storytelling can truly illustrate those three parts: resilience, diversity, and growth. How can storytelling connect people across differences, especially in relationships and in professional spaces?
Okay, so this is a very concise example that you can extrapolate the meaning of. I have a very simple response to that. I was working with a client who was the maid of honor. She was maid of honor for her best friend who came from an incredibly wealthy and privileged background. My client did not. She grew up with violence. She basically lived at her friend's mansion, and her friend's parents were like her parents. But she was almost trembling thinking about having to deliver this speech. I worked with her 2 times, and I sent her edits in between. And so I was able to sort of use what I know about storytelling and the healing aspects of storytelling and leaning into your edge. The edge of when you're doing yoga, like you push, you push, you push, and then you hold it at your edge. That's a challenge, but not so much that you lose track of your breathing. So that's what creative nonfiction, I think, does. It's really asking yourself, what are you afraid of? And the 2 things that I always work with people, whether it's doing speeches or writing their memoir, are the same 2 things that I learned when I was 19 years old, and then again when I was in my early 20s and I was doing rape crisis counseling. And we were always told to say, I believe you when you're talking to the client, the survivor. I believe you. And it's not your fault, which is 100% true whenever someone asks for your help. So it's, I believe you and it's not your fault. And that sort of like frees the client up. I mean, as Anne Lamott said, if people wanted better representations of themselves in your books, they should have treated you better. So my client, she's not going to hang out dirty laundry, but she leaned into herself and I believed her. And whatever happened to her wasn't her fault. And she wowed this very privileged, very moneyed crowd on a totally different side of politics than she was. And she sort of, in a very safe psychological way, made herself stand out so that people were beyond impressed, were moved by her speech, and they will never forget it. Up until now, we've been mainly focused on storytelling in a creative sense, in a personal sense, and an emotional sense. And so what I'm curious about, as I'm sure you are too, is how storytelling aligns with leadership, say in those VUCA environments, and how storytelling helps people grow and adapt through sharing their.
Yeah, listen, if you guys listened to our last podcast, we talked a little bit about VUCA, right? VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous times. These are very challenging times that people deal with, like the pandemic. We talked about financial crisis, security threats at 9/11. It could be on a larger scale, it could be on a smaller scale, still impacting a great number of people. And being able to share stories and to align with one another is key when you're looking at VUCA situations. If you don't, then you really have a problem trying to get through them and you start backpedaling and being more reactive than proactive. We talked a little bit about learning agility today and how Amanda used learning agility, how the business world used learning agility. What I found, and this is really part of my dissertation study, was that one of the pieces that truly help organizations and businesses achieve during VUCA times is learning agility and being able to look at how your situations in the past can be used, no matter how different they are, to better the future. Storytelling is key with that. If you're not able to share your leadership stories, how you're able to get through things together from a leadership standpoint, then you're going to have a hard time figuring out how to advance, how to get through that situation in the future. So storytelling and sharing stories among leaders is absolutely key to making sure that you have this success.
Thanks for that, Malcolm. So to our listeners, we would love to hear your thoughts or a favorite story that's inspired you. Feel free to jump into the conversation and share with us through social media. And all the links are on our brand new sparkling website, www.bridgingworldspodcast.com.
It is a pretty cool site. So thanks for all of your input, Amanda, and making sure that it looks wonderful and great. Listen, storytelling isn't just about the past, it's also a tool for growth and a skill for the future. Amanda's work shows how words can bridge gaps and drive progress, even in the most unexpected ways. So let's keep exploring. Amanda, how do you help clients find their voices?
My philosophy in my personal work, in my public work, is to trust the process. And to trust my client's process involves sort of standing out of the way. So I've had the experience of different instructors sort of rewriting or heavily editing my work to the point where they put their stamp on. And what I do is the exact opposite of that. Is I ask a lot of questions in the beginning, face to face on Zoom. And I ask them what they want, what the end result is of this, what the purpose, what sort of audience they visualize, what is their style or tone. And I ask a lot of questions. And then I just try to get them to be their fullest sense of that possible. I am sort of ushering them into their fullest selves. And that means examining fears, perfectionism and procrastination, naming names or naming pseudonyms of people that have wronged them. I believe that you don't really process the data information in your life until you've written it down to some extent, because the discovery process is always new with beginner's minds. So if you can be writing and it can be like, oh my God, I didn't even know that I was thinking about that or worried about that, and it comes out in the writing. At the same time, I very much try to de-romanticize writing. There's no muse. It's basically, from my perspective, it's butt in chair. So it's 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration. Do not wait for the perfect time or day. It will never come. It's like you practice an instrument. It's like you practice a sport. It's repetition. And then I always tell my clients and students too, there's this famous anecdote pottery class, and it was divided in half. And on one side, the instructor said, try to make one perfect pot, like one, I'm not going to tell you what that means, but the most perfect pot you can possibly make. And the other half of the class, the instructor said, just make as many pots as humanly possible. They can be ugly, they can not stand up, they can defy gravity, whatever. The half of the class that made the most amount of pots that were imperfect. So if you're trying to make one perfect novel or whatever, that's never going to happen because the pressure is immense. That's when perfectionism sets in. That's when procrastination rears its head. It's really when you're just making a whole bunch of, like Anne Lamott says, shitty first drafts. You're making as many shitty first drafts of shitty first pots as you can. And that's where the process adds into a more perfect product.
So, when balancing creative passion with meaningful work, what are some of the strategies for staying motivated and focused?
I'm going to give you a few very practical ways of going about your creative life and your business life. You can't do everything well. You're not going to do everything well. Got to work on your perfectionism. Someone will always find fault with what you're doing. So you might as well do what you want to do anyway. So that's sort of a psychological mindset that helps me. I'm lowering my expectations, so that goes hand in hand with perfectionism. I really like Stephen King's book on writing, and he talks about the zero draft, which is like Anne Lamott's first draft. And the zero draft or the first draft, you write with the door closed. And then the second draft, you have to crack the door and you have to see your writing from the outside in. I think that that sort of simplifies the different editing processes that are going on. There's just little tips and tricks. I have accountability partners. My friend Reagan, hey Reagan, she and I meet on Zoom and say hi, catch up for a little bit, and then work for 3 or 4 hours online and like take little breaks and stare at one another working. And then at the end, talk about what we accomplished, and I say hi to our kids and stuff like that. So that works for me. As far as accountability, also, if a Pomodoro is good for you, so you work for 45 minutes, you set a timer, and then you take a break for 15 minutes, whether you feel like it or not, that works very well. I usually, at the end of a writing session, I end where I know exactly where I'm going to pick up the next day. The next morning or afternoon, I'm not just staring at a blank screen. I can just jump right in. And then the last little trick that I will offer up is that I wrote my novel 400 pages at a time, or 400, where I wish I wrote it 400 words at a time. And so I was part of this online writing group with my friend Valerie. Hi, Valerie. And so every day, 5 days a week, we would write 400 words of whatever we were working on. I think that it was mostly people working on their dissertations or publications after their PhD when they were teaching. But 400 words anybody can do. It's like a little bit over 1 page, double space. So what you do is you sit down and you're already at 800 words. It's just an excuse to get your butt in the chair, your body to the yoga mat, and then muscle memory takes over. And I wrote my whole book, 400 words at a time. And for accountability, I would send the 400 words in document form to the woman who organizes this online writing group, and nobody would read it. Nobody would see it. But in the subject line, I would just put 878 words or 401 words or whatever. So we sort of have to be our best Yodas, our inner Yodas, and give us the best advice that works for us. There are different things that work for different people. And the only way you're going to learn about yourself and your writing practice is just doing it. There's no romance in it.
I love that. And speaking of Yoda, right behind you, we have a quote on the wall that Caleb gave me for Father's Day one year. It reads, "Do or do not, there is no try, Yoda." And the things that you're talking about really remind me of the business world that I live in, the business world that I work with leaders, and ensuring that they're able to develop themselves in a direction that really ties into the learning agility that you have, Amanda, that you share with others. The experimenting, okay? You have to try, like Yoda said. Go out there and figure out what works. Look at what you've done in the past, good or bad. Reflect on that, right? And then keep evolving over time. These are the things that are going to help you. You talked a little bit about, the Pomodoro. I've done that too. Jody, shout out to Jody, who's my dissertation chair. She got me into using that, taking minutes at a time before you get back to the writing that you're doing. Same thing with business-wise. You can go on and on with meetings, but you're not really accomplishing. You want to make sure you have time to reflect on what you're doing before you continue to evolve and work with others in the business world. This is a factor no matter if you're in the most dire straits in a VUCA environment or if you're just in a regular environment that you're in. You keep evolving, Amanda. You keep figuring out ways to be better and better yourself. That's true for all leaders out there. That's true for people who are just at home. You may be in a family where you're trying to figure out what you're doing, or you may be dealing with elderly parents or something, and you have to figure out what works for you. What are some of the things that I could do to help my father? What are some of the things I could do to help my mother based on who they are, who I am, and the situation that we have at hand? So something that we should continue to think about over time. Amanda's insights remind us that creativity and leadership are deeply connected. Now, as a wrap up, let's reflect on what we've learned today.
In conclusion, storytelling is about much more than just words. It's about creating connection, clarity, and growth.
And it's a powerful reminder that learning agility and creativity go hand in hand. We grow the most when we're willing to adapt, share, and listen. Thanks for joining us as we bridge worlds through creativity today. Let's keep the conversation going. Feel free to join us on our website, www.bridgingworldspodcast.com. Please follow us, subscribe, rate us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Apple Music, YouTube Music, and RSS.
Until next time, keep growing, keep connecting, and keep telling your story.